objection, Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. We have quorum. We'll get started. I'll recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the current crisis in Lebanon. This subcommittee last held a hearing on Lebanon in November 2019 after mass protests began, bringing more than 1 million people into the streets. The spontaneity, durability, and size of these demonstrations signified deep frustration with the Lebanese political system and the pillars of corruption that uphold it. Today, as we approach the first anniversary of the Beirut port explosion on August 4th, an unavoidable man-made catastrophe that was symptomatic of the same corruption, we will assess Lebanon's rapidly deteriorating political, economic, and humanitarian crises and try to offer practical policy measures that the Biden administration should consider in response. The World Bank assesses that Lebanon's ongoing economic collapse, and I quote, is likely to rank in the top 10, possibly top 3 most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century, close quote. This is due in large part to the precipitous depreciation of the Lebanese lira by roughly 130% in 2020, falling much further throughout 2021. Massive inflation led the government to reduce or eliminate subsidies on essential goods, leading to widespread blackouts and shortages, as well as rising tensions. Military leaders warn this vicious cycle has devalued the salaries of military personnel and thereby created an unstable security situation. Meanwhile, the UN claims that Lebanon's public water system could collapse at any moment, likely within weeks, and 80% of Lebanese households lack money to buy adequate food. These are startling statistics. The World Bank has also called the crisis deliberate because, as with the Beirut port explosion, decision makers in Lebanon are aware of the problems, but they're failing spectacularly at doing anything to fix them. The resignation of Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri 2 weeks ago, after 9 months of efforts to form a government, illustrates Lebanon's political gridlock and the inability or unwillingness of political elites to avert or mitigate the ongoing economic crisis and resulting instability. This presents a challenge to the international community, which seeks to tie assistance packages to the implementation of greater accountability, transparency, and anti-corruption measures. I encourage the Biden administration to strongly support such an approach and also consider additional measures to go after corruption among Lebanese officials if the status quo persists or worsens, sending the signal that we will use the power of our financial system to root out corruption and to promote stability. At the same time, the consequences of further deterioration are extremely worrisome and must be avoided. For example, the region cannot absorb another massive refugee outflow. We must be mindful of Lebanon's recent civil war and pervasive sectarian tensions, and also avoid any steps that catalyze sectarianism and internal conflict. I'm particularly sensitive to the fact that a breakdown of the state would likely strengthen the influence of U.S. adversaries in Lebanon, including Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. To that end, I want to quickly reiterate my strong support for ongoing U.S. partnership with the Lebanese armed forces. As I have said repeatedly before, I share many of my colleagues' concerns about Hezbollah's massive rocket and missile arsenal in Lebanon and the LAF's inability to prevent Hezbollah's military buildup and dangerous activities on Lebanon's borders that threaten Israel. But based on what we consistently hear from national security officials, trusted Lebanese counterparts, and security analysts, is that despite its deficiencies, the Lebanese armed forces remains a vitally important counterweight to Hezbollah and is extremely reliable in terms of end-use monitoring. The LAF has earned our continued support even as it struggles to protect Lebanese sovereignty during this acute economic crisis. And finally, Since 2011, more than 1 million Syrian refugees have migrated to Lebanon, placing strain on Lebanese public services and host communities. The U.S. has provided more than $2.7 billion in humanitarian assistance in Lebanon since fiscal year 2012 and must continue to meet the needs of refugees. I hope that we will see an international effort to assist the people of Lebanon and to help prevent a total humanitarian collapse. I'm really grateful that this morning we have a distinguished panel of witnesses who are abundantly qualified to help us better understand what's happening in Lebanon, navigate these really vexing challenges, and offer suggestions to protect U.S. interests and promote the long-term well-being of Lebanon. I want to thank them again for their participation before handing it over to Ranking Member Wilson. So thanks to all of our witnesses, and I'll now yield to the Ranking Member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this important hearing, and we sincerely appreciate the dedication of the witnesses that are appearing today. Lebanon has endured significant hardship following the end of the civil war and Syrian occupation, but there was hope among the people for freedom and democracy of what an extraordinary country Lebanon has been. Unfortunately, these high hopes have not been materialized. The people have urgently protested the situation, calling for the reforms for nearly 2 years, and yet the Lebanese elite continued to drive the country toward failure. Today, as corruption and malign influence threaten total collapse, the people of Lebanon stand to lose the most. Iran has maintained a significant interference in Lebanon through terrorist proxy masquerading as a legitimate political party. The last year has shown the people of Lebanon are tired of Hezbollah's influence and the rampant corruption emanating from their political class. Despite generous support from the international community, it's concerning that there's little effort to root out corruption. I was grateful to support the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act and its amendments to curtail Hezbollah destabilizing activity. Last Congress, I introduced the Hezbollah Money Laundering Prevention Act, which builds on current sanctions and determines whether areas under Hezbollah control are havens for money laundering. Providing more resources to Hezbollah and the brutal Assad regime next door will do nothing to alleviate the suffering of the Lebanese people. Until the issue of corruption is addressed, I am concerned the people of Lebanon will continue to suffer. Additionally, I am grateful that Lebanon hosts Syrian refugees of the brutal Assad regime, but I'm concerned about the reports of forced repatriation of Syrian refugees. While most of these refugees live in extreme poverty, sadly, the reality of turning to Syria is much more dangerous. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing from each about how the United States can help the people of Lebanon without enriching bad actors. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. I'll now introduce our distinguished witnesses. Ms. Amoni Yacoubian is a senior advisor on Syria, the Middle East, and North Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. Her research focuses on conflict analysis and prevention in the Middle East, with a specific focus on Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. She also served as the executive director of the congressionally mandated Syria Study Group from 2019 to 2020. Ms. Yacoubian previously served as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Middle East Bureau at USAID from 2014 to 2017, where she had responsibility for Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Dr. Rhonda Slim is a senior fellow and the director of the program on conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues at the Middle East Institute in Washington, and is a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She works and publishes on regional international issues of the Middle East with an emphasis on Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. A former vice president of the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, Slim has also been a senior program advisor at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a guest scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace, a program director at Resolve, Inc., and a program officer at the Kettering Foundation. And she's developed and managed a number of dialogue and peace-building projects in the Middle East. And finally, Mr. David Shanker is the Taub Senior Fellow at Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's the former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 2019 to 2021. As Assistant Secretary, he was Principal Middle East Advisor to the Secretary of State and senior official overseeing the conduct of U.S. policy and diplomacy in the MENA region. Prior to joining the State Department, Schenker worked as the Ofsian Fellow and Director of the Beth and David Gadul Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute from 2006 to 2019, and served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Levant Country Director, the Pentagon's top policy aide on the Arab nations of the Levant from 2002 to 2006. These are distinguished witnesses that we are all quite familiar with, and we're glad to see all of them and have them here. Thanks for being here, and I will now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the record. Ms. Yacoubian, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the unprecedented crisis in Lebanon and the challenges posed for U.S. policy. The timing for this hearing is especially important. The lights are blinking red in Lebanon as the country hurdles toward total collapse. I've followed developments in Lebanon for several years, and I'm a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace. However, the views I express here today are my own. It's difficult to overestimate both the gravity and urgency of the situation in Lebanon and the detrimental impact that state collapse would have on U.S. national security interests. Lebanon is in a freefall, propelled by a series of cascading crises. The catalyst for Lebanon's downward spiral began with the 2019 financial crisis, driven by mounting debt and what has been termed a Ponzi scheme economy. The COVID pandemic further compounded the crisis. Then, nearly 1 year ago, the devastating Beirut port blast, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, killed 200 and wounded thousands. The statistics reflecting Lebanon's rapid downward spiral are staggering. The Lebanese lira has lost more than 90% of its value. Hyperinflation has set in, with food prices up more than 600%. The economy contracted by 20% last year. The humanitarian impacts are also dire. More than 50% of Lebanese now live below the poverty line, with 25% living in extreme poverty. The UN estimates that 75% of Lebanese families are food insecure. UNICEF warns that more than 70% of Lebanese are at immediate risk of losing access to safe water as public water systems collapse. An estimated 1.3 million Lebanese children have dropped out of school since October 2019. If unaddressed, Lebanon's cascading crises could provoke a total security breakdown, either from the top down or the bottom up. Concerns are mounting that the army will not be able to meet its soldiers' basic needs, precipitating a collapse of the one institution preventing total chaos in Lebanon. Lebanon is also threatened by a bottom-up social explosion as tensions rise and protests, riots, and even armed confrontations are becoming more commonplace. Politically, Lebanon has been at an impasse, with politicians slow to act. The July 26 designation of Premier Najib Mikati as prime minister is an important development, but it's only a first step. Mikati faces a daunting set of challenges. First, he must form a cabinet. Second, that cabinet must be capable and empowered to implement deep reform. At its core, Lebanon is witnessing a reckoning based on decades of pervasive corruption, entrenched patronage, poor governance, and a lack of accountability. State collapse in Lebanon would have dire consequences for both regional stability and U.S. national security interests. First, when states collapse, security vacuums emerge, potentially leading to a resurgence of violent extremism. Second, the Iranian-backed militia Hezbollah is best poised to weather a total state collapse, with a demonstrated capacity to rely on its own security infrastructure and social welfare networks. Third, state collapse could precipitate a major displacement crisis. And fourth, state failure in Lebanon holds the potential to provoke broader regional insecurity. As Lebanon's downward spiral accelerates, the U.S. should focus on 4 urgent priorities. 1, provide additional humanitarian assistance through direct cash assistance to the most vulnerable Lebanese. 2, maintain pressure on the Lebanese political class to ensure immediate cabinet formation and reform implementation. The U.S. should develop coercive measures to convey the credible threat of targeted sanctions against those impeding progress on these critical steps. 3, provide additional support to the Lebanese armed forces. Potential options include a one-time tranche of cash assistance or DoD direct support to Lebanese army commissaries. And 4, insist that the 2022 elections occur on time and reestablish funding for elections monitoring. Beyond these urgent steps, the U.S. should also undertake measures that bolster Lebanon's capacities and guard against entrenching aid dependency. Specifically, harness the expertise and financing of the Lebanese diaspora, increase USAID's education funding, expand USAID's economic growth programming. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yakubian. Ms. Slim, you're next. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Lebanon is facing the most acute economic crisis since the famine crisis of World War I. It is the result of decades of systemic corruption and mismanagement of public funds by a political class working in concert with Lebanese financial and banking officials. The economic crisis has impoverished the majority of Lebanese. The once strong Lebanese middle class is quickly vanishing. Vulnerable groups, including women, children, and refugee communities, are bearing the brunt of the deteriorating conditions. On the security front, 2 alarming trends are taking shape. 1, security fragmentation and localization as people begin turning for security to local armed groups, be they militias, gangs, or criminal networks. And second, an expanding crime-terror nexus as extremist and terrorist groups merge with networks of drug, human, and arms trafficking and cross-border smuggling. A long-lasting impact of the crisis will be on the country's human capital. Thousands of highly skilled Lebanese, including doctors, nurses, teachers, IT specialists, especially young ones, are leaving the country in droves. As we know from experiences from other post-conflict stabilization efforts, it takes decades to replenish this human capital. The economic crisis has had a mixed impact on Hezbollah. On one hand, it has forced a large portion of Lebanon's Shia to turn to Hezbollah for financial assistance, thus strengthening the hold of Hezbollah on the Shia community in Lebanon. In response to this, Hezbollah has rolled out a financial assistance and subsidy program targeting its supporters only. On the other hand, this increase in demand on Hezbollah for financial assistance is coming at a time when its finances are under stress due to a number of factors, which I discuss in some detail in my written testimony. Along with other political leaders, Hezbollah is recalculating how to maintain the status quo while managing an angry popular mood that is holding all political parties, including Hezbollah, responsible for the deteriorating economic condition and for the Beirut port blast. The image that Hezbollah spent years cultivating inside Lebanon, especially among Lebanon's Shia, as a non-corrupt and non-establishment group, anti-establishment group, is no more. It's widely seen now as part and parcel of the corrupt political class that brought Lebanese to the terrible condition they find themselves in. While the US cannot fix Lebanon's multiple woes, we should not walk away from the challenges Lebanon presents. However dysfunctional its democracy is, Lebanon remains one of the few Arab countries in the Middle East with relatively strong civil liberties, a free media environment, a vibrant civil society, and multi-confessional coexistence. Through Hezbollah, Iran threatens the United States, Israel, and our Arab allies and partners' interests, while the rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS has receded in Lebanon thanks to strong, sustained effort by the Lebanese armed forces. These gains could erode quickly amid a deteriorating economic crisis that provides recruitment opportunities for extremist groups. Russia is increasingly eyeing Lebanon as part of its expansionist strategy in the Mediterranean region. If we cede ground in Lebanon, Iran and Russia will quickly fill the vacuum. Working with allies and partners in Europe and the Arab region, the United States should mobilize humanitarian assistance to mitigate the impact of the economic crisis on people's lives. but our decision to assist Lebanese officials to secure the assistance of the international community, including the IMF, World Bank, key countries like France, UK, Germany, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, in developing an emergency funding package to rescue the economy should depend primarily on the decision that the Lebanese officials and the Lebanese people make, including implementation of economic reforms. In my written testimony, I discuss 4 areas for US engagement, working with allies and partners in Europe and the Arab region. First, mitigating economic hardships by scaling up existing aid programs to Lebanese and refugee communities in the form of cash handouts, distribution of food and medicine, and provision of medical care. There is also a need for putting in place long-term, sustainable and solutions focusing on self-reliance and livelihood programs. Second, working again with allies in Europe, especially France, we should lead an international diplomatic effort to put pressure on the Lebanese politician toward the formation of a cabinet of independent and competent technocrats. Third, the US, along with France again, should lead 53 Lebanese. I thank you again for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slim. We appreciate your testimony. Mr. Schenker, nice to see you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the crisis in Lebanon today. Nearly a year has passed since the catastrophic Beirut port explosion, which killed 200 and left 300,000 homeless. The port explosion reflected the long-standing disregard of Lebanon's political elite for the well-being. So was the coup de grace. Support for FMF. The collaboration is problematic and needs to be addressed. Washington needs to hold the LAF to a high standard. The Biden administration should engage in a process of leveraging U.S. funding to weed out the most senior officers loyal to Hezbollah in the LAF. The Biden administration also should likewise condition assistance on the LAF ending its obscene practice of employing military tribunals to target Hezbollah's critics at home and abroad, including my.
I've been to Lebanon. I've followed Lebanon for well over 40 years. I was there in the 80s when things looked pretty dire. And here we are 40 years later, and things are even worse. Let me begin by asking perhaps Ms. Yacoubian and others could comment. Just, is the logic of a country, Lebanon, in fact, really a false premise, that there really is no country to be had, that the logic of a Lebanon as such does not exist, that the sectional and communal differences and disputes are so fundamental that we're never going to put it back together again as a sovereign, independent state that functions as a state. The corruption, the evasion of normal economic responsibilities like taxation are so ingrained, the differences now so sharpened and acute that putting it all back together as one really is just, you know, a false hope. And to Mr. Schenker, I just say I am old enough to remember when we had to try to rebuild the Lebanese armed forces, and it fell apart along sectoral lines. And I'd be interested in your observations as well. I mean, has something changed that we now have some inner cohesion that will keep the Lebanese armed forces together so that it is a unifying protective force? Or is that at risk as well? I'd be interested maybe to start with you, Ms. Yacoubian, on your reaction. And I'm not trying to say let's just give up on Lebanon, but I almost despair as to what the solutions are to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. And I certainly understand your despair and in many ways share it. It's not lost, I think, on many of us that the 100th anniversary of Lebanon's creation was last year. And I think even then questions were being raised. But that being said, first, I guess I would respond by saying it's not on us. It's not on the US. to rebuild and fix Lebanon. It's for the Lebanese to do. The depth of your despair is understandable, but that said, as the daughter of Lebanese immigrants, there was a time in Lebanon, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, prior to the Civil War, where it truly was a multi-confessional model for the region. It suffers enormous issues around governance and corruption that we've laid out. But it's certainly not the only country in the region, and I allude to this in my testimony. This is a region-wide set of challenges that need to be addressed. I don't think we can afford to walk away from Lebanon. I don't think we should give up in despair and believe that this idea is no longer viable. You see it in the energy of many of the Lebanese people. You see it in their entrepreneurial spirit. Even with, frankly, the storied Lebanese resilience, which has now been tested beyond, frankly, any resilience. So I maintain hope that this is indeed a country that exists not only as an idea, but that can in reality. But the Lebanese people are deserving of a better system of governance. They are trying, I believe, their best to bring it about. We need to look at our policies and our assistance programming and make sure that we are not entrenching some of the more sort of negative trends of the country, and that we work to help the Lebanese themselves to build back the country that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Connolly. It's a good question about whether this is an institution that is built to withstand the test of time. We all do remember what happened during the Civil War and the splitting of the military along sectarian fissures. When I was in the Department of Defense in 2005, at the time, Lebanon was receiving about $1.5 million a year, all in IMET. And when the people of Lebanon stood up and threw the Syrians out and ended the decades-long occupation, we decided to back the institution to the tune of something like $70 million a year. Now it's up to something like $120 million a year. The idea there was to build a bit of an institution that had broader range capabilities, mostly in terms of border security and domestic security. This was never intended, obviously, to take on Hezbollah or take on controversial missions that would test sectarian ability to withstand sectarian pressures. I think we have to have fairly low expectations for the LAF and hope it stays together to do this type of public security mission domestically. If Lebanon is ever going to have a future, the LAF is going to have to be an institution that works. As we know, almost no institution works in Lebanon. So I am not incredibly hopeful, but I think it's worth a shot.
Others?
Mr. Connolly, your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Wilson, the ranking member, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch. And again, amazingly enough, I agree with President Congressman Connolly, Jerry Connolly. And it is sad about the gloom and also the despair. And I look forward to working in a bipartisan way as we try to assist. Additionally, it's particularly sad for me because I grew up in South Carolina where the Syrian Lebanese community assimilated so well. I mean, they're leaders in business, leaders in government, just phenomenally successful. And so it's particularly sad that, as Ms. Yakubian has pointed out, how entrepreneurial, successful. And of course, I've been to Beirut and to see what it could be, what it has been, the Paris, the Middle East. But, and also I have another personal connection. One of my former staff members actually lived adjacent to the port, and her condominium was destroyed. Thank goodness that afternoon, she called me, let me know that she had not been present, but it would have been catastrophic otherwise. Bottom line is, the people of America do care about the people of Lebanon and want the best. With that in mind, Secretary Schenker, what levers does the United States have to disincentivize further corruption by the elites of Lebanon? Which specific types of sanctions or others might be most effective?
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. Well, when I was in the administration, we implemented a series of global Magnitsky sanctions against corrupt Lebanese politicians. The president's son-in-law, Gibran Bassil, Youssef Finyanos, Ali Hassan Khalil. This is a cross sect, not Christian, Sunni, Shia. I think that these are effective measures. Nobody wants to be branded corrupt. Of course, in Lebanon, these people are widely known to be corrupt, and trucking with Hezbollah and aiding and abetting this broken system. But to have it spelled out on a piece of paper, the bigger issue, and to make these more effective, I think that we really need to get the Europeans on board. And this has been a real problem. France in particular, a lot of these political elite in Lebanon enjoy their time in Paris, have bank accounts there. When we designate for corruption, it's a largely symbolic measure, but it's a lot more impactful should it come from France or the European Union. The EU and France have said that sanctions are coming, but we have not yet seen any enacted.
Hey, well, thank you for your leadership in regard to the Magnitsky Act, and more Americans need to know how effective and the achievements of what you did. And Dr. Slim, you noted Lebanese level of corruption. How does the corruption manifest? How do the political elites use their positions to skim money for their own benefit?
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. The way the system has been set is, and especially since the end of the Civil War in 1990 and the Taif Agreement, is that all positions at the cabinet level, at the sub-cabinet levels, are divided among the different parties. And all kind of public contracting is done according to a certain, formula of dividing this public money among these different parties through procuring public contracts to them. And it's also a system whereby political posts and are divided among political parties. And so even bureaucrats need to show loyalties to the political party because they owe their appointments and their positions to these parties. The question I would like to add to what my colleagues have just said, whether it is a hopeless situation, I would like to say that the Lebanese themselves have been trying to change the system. It's the political economy underpinning it, the political structure itself. Since now 2005, we have seen uprising in 2005, we have seen uprising in 2015, we have seen uprising in 2019, and every time with every uprising, they don't upend the status quo, but they deal a dent in the architecture of this political system and this political economy. And so it's a long-term project, but the Lebanese themselves are committed to this process of upending a status quo that has now brought them to the catastrophe that they are experiencing today.
And thank you. And indeed, we need to also address Hezbollah and the rockets that they have threatening Israel. 100,000 rockets, Iranian provided, but that would be another issue that I'm confident that Chairman Deutsch is going to approach. Okay, I just know he'll do it. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I thank you for putting that trust in me. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Trust the entire committee shares, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for holding this hearing, Chairman Deutsch and Ranking Member Wilson. It comes obviously at a really important time, and thank you to our witnesses. This testimony is, of course, very sobering, and I think we all feel a little despondent when you think about the persistent lack of governance, the rampant corruption, the gross mismanagement that have made Lebanon's difficulties even greater. And, the engagement by the United Nations, the World Bank, the EU don't seem to have made much progress. But I guess my first question is really related to the Lebanese Armed Forces, the LAF. This relationship between the LAF and the United States goes back a very long time. And obviously, in light of the powerful role of Hezbollah, the Lebanese Armed Forces has been an important counterweight. And so my first question is really, what is your assessment about the LEF's capacity today, the real risk that it could collapse? Is it currently in a position to fulfill border security and counterterrorism functions, particularly to root out, ISIS militants at the border? So kind of what is the realistic prospect it collapses? And if it survives, is it able to perform the kind of functions that are so necessary to some semblance of stability and some counterweight to Hezbollah? I don't know, Mr. Schenker, do you want to start or?
Yes, thank you, Representative Cicilline. Well, first, let me say I don't believe Hezbollah is I don't believe the LAF is a counterweight to Hezbollah. Certainly, it is a more positive force, but for reasons that we talked about earlier, it does nothing to oppose Hezbollah, and in fact, acts oftentimes periodically. I think deconflicts with Hezbollah. Protects them in a way, prevents UNIFIL in the south from getting to locations after rockets are fired to protect Hezbollah. That said, they are capable in terms of domestic counterterrorism mission. They have a high-level capability, according to CENTCOM. They increasingly are doing some work in certain areas that are not controlled by Hezbollah on the border, primarily with Syria and not with Israel. As for the collapse, when you have your standard non-commissioned officer who is making $800 a month now, and that is less than, worth less than $70 or so, you're starting to see some defections, people going home, trying to figure out other ways to support their families. The LAF has not served meat to their conscripts in some time. The Qatar is donating 80 tons a month of food to the LAF. I think that, it's shaking and there's a great deal of concern. That said, I do think, funds from the United States, other donors in the Arab world will prevent this from bottoming out anytime soon, but it's not a great trajectory. They need a government and they need to turn things around and take these deep type of reforms. It's also important ultimately that the LAF root out the elements of Hezbollah that are within the force.
Can I just ask in my minute and a half that's remaining, each of the witnesses, what is one thing Congress should do that would help set the table for a long-term political and economic recovery from Lebanon? Like we hear this narrative, which is very depressing in a lot of ways, but what actions can we take that raise the hope that there will be some long-term political and economic solution in Lebanon? Ms. Yacobian, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, I'm happy. Thank you, Congressman. I'm happy to jump in. I think two things. One, I think the Congress should act immediately to address the humanitarian suffering of the Lebanese people. This could lead to this bottom-up social implosion that I referenced. And number two, I think the Congress should keep the pressure on Lebanon's political class, because ultimately there's going to be no rescue of Lebanon until there is a credible government in place that is willing to implement the reforms that have been on the table for years. Those are the two key measures I would recommend.
Sun?
Yes, I agree with Ms. Yacobian. And I think the one important thing that Congress needs to do is, in fact, two things. One is to sustain pressure on the US administration to pay attention to Lebanon. I think there are too many priorities now for the US administration, and Lebanon can fall by the wayside. But second, I think this public call by Congress, continuous public call by Congress, and pressure on the administration to put in place an international investigation of the port blast. 1 year since the blast, the local investigation, the government-led investigation, has yielded no results. And we and many civil society groups see this committee, an international committee that gets to the bottom, of what happened, who was responsible, which officials are committed criminal negligence, is really a first step to ending corruption and holding officials accountable and ending impunity in Lebanon.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the indulgence.
Mr. Cicilline, Mr. Kinzinger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. Let me just ask, so I was actually in Lebanon, I guess, a couple of years ago now. Time flies through COVID. Was able to get to the Blue Line with the UN, so the UN Foundation. Obviously saw the, how difficult and challenging all that is, and you see how much Hezbollah is integrated in daily society. Let me just ask, and so, I think that brings to light the importance of the Lebanese armed forces, as Mr. Cicilline was talking about. So to follow up on his questions, who benefits? I'll start with Mr. Shanker. Who benefits from a weakened Lebanese armed forces? Who's the beneficiary of that?
Thank you, Representative Kinzinger. Well, certainly Hezbollah benefits. If the LAF is weak, accedes to all Hezbollah demands, prevents UNIFIL from getting to locations, establishes these areas called Green Without Borders, where the LAF it's basically a no-go zone, a no-go Hezbollah military zone. They benefit. Hezbollah benefits from that. There's no doubt.
And let me ask you, too, I'll stay with you. So even before the Lebanese government collapsed, we knew that there was dire need for economic and political reforms. The IMF bailout requires many of these reforms to be addressed before billions of dollars can be infused into the economy. In your opinion, what are the most important reforms that are needed to improve the situation in Lebanon and the lives of the people there?
Goodness, well, they have, it's a good question. I think we've written quite a bit about this. The energy sector in Lebanon is incredibly corrupt, dysfunctional. I think the banking sector is also, the regulatory problems. They've run amok. Lack of transparency with the central bank. It's been an endemic problem as well. You can go across the board. The Ministry of Health. There's no public records on how the money is spent. It disappears. So it's across all sectors, really.
Do you feel like the biggest, I guess, linchpin is just really, when it comes down to it, corruption or a desire to cover it up, I guess?
Yes, I think Transparency International places it, on the last 25 in the world, the bottom, 157th out of 180 or something like this. It's incredibly corrupt. And as I said earlier, this is not just Hezbollah who benefits from this corrupt system. It's, all political elites to a greater or lesser extent.
And let me just ask, this will be my last question. I'll stick with you too. Without serious reforms or direct economic relief, do you think the current crisis in Lebanon impacts the potential for war between Hezbollah and Israel?
No, I don't. I think you get, massive migration that Representative Deutsch spoke about earlier. I think that you will get a flight. Anybody who can will get out. You will see the country emptying out of its Christian population. But I think anybody who's got the means will get on a boat and go to Europe. Hezbollah, I don't think right now wants to push for a war. Things are bad enough. Possibly they would want to do so to change the subject. But I think that, in this lowering tide, the Hezbollah boat still floats higher than all the rest.
Good analogy. So, well, thanks to all the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the minute left.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Vice Chair Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this very important hearing, and I will agree with my colleagues. This is a distressing and rather depressing the information that we're getting is even more depressing than I would have anticipated. I want to pick up on Ranking Member Wilson's suggested question, because I was in Israel in July of 2006 when Hezbollah started firing rockets on Israel. And one of the most distressing parts about that attack was that the biggest price that was paid was by Lebanese children and families, because Hezbollah had their rocket launchers in the middle of homes and villages. So it's not just the Israelis who are at risk, it's the Lebanese civilian populations. So I wonder if anybody can comment on what can be done to deal with the 100,000 rockets that Hezbollah has pointed at Israel. And our most recent understanding is that the Iranians are helping Hezbollah upgrade the precision of those rockets. What can be done? And has there been, has the attitude of the Lebanese people toward Hezbollah shifted at all? And I open that question, Mr. Shanker, you were talking about the missiles, so I'll turn it to you if you'd like to take the question.
Well, sure. Listen, thank you very much, Vice Chair Manning. I agree with you. I think the precision-guided missile project, the PGM upgrade project that Hezbollah is doing, Israel has defined that as a red line. This is basically to make what are 150,000 dumb rockets and missiles into very smart and accurate missiles. And this is a strategic threat to Israel. This is not only Israel's energy, desal, but also runways at air bases, et cetera. Very dangerous. Listen, what I tried to do when I was in the administration was to strengthen the mandate of UNIFIL. If they're not going to do the job, which was to prevent Hezbollah from rearming after 2006, well, why do there have to be 15,000 or 10,000 of them? I think there should be less, or they should actually work to implement their mandate, and that the government of Lebanon should be held responsible if it's not going to either encourage them to pursue their mandate. The LAF has to be held to a high standard on that as well. We have to call them out and read these reports and talk about what the LAF and what the government of Lebanon is and is not doing. Sanctions, of course, but also legislation that has been worked on the Hill on human shields. I think that this is, helpful as well to hold Hezbollah or Hezbollah allies in Lebanon responsible for the placing of these munitions in among civilian populations, and indeed in the basements of apartment buildings. It's incredibly dangerous.
But in light of the meltdown we've just discussed, is there any hope that the LAF would be willing to go after Hezbollah on these issues?
No hope whatsoever.
Are there any other alternatives?
I think that the whole international community has to get behind a common understanding of what Hezbollah is. This would entail an EU designation of and ending this fiction of a political wing versus a military wing of Hezbollah. This impedes and makes more difficult the sanctioning of Hezbollah fundraising and other efforts in Europe. I think that the first step would be to delegitimate the organization.
Thank you. I want to turn to the refugee crisis. Ms. Yacoubian, we've talked a little bit about the over 1 million Syrian refugees who have been in Lebanon since 2011 and the pressure that they have placed on Lebanese public services and host communities. Is there anything that can be done to help lift the burden of the refugees on Lebanon, and also to help the refugees themselves?
Thank you, Representative Manning, and thank you for raising that very important question, because I do think often we don't always remember that Lebanon hosts the largest number of refugees per capita in the world. It is actually providing an important international public good in doing so. Unfortunately, what we've seen is as the economic situation has spiraled downward, the situation for Syrian refugees is particularly dire, that more than 90% live in extreme poverty. there's growing concern about tensions between Lebanese host communities and Syrian refugees. There's worry not only about a displacement crisis, but maybe even forcible return of refugees back to Syria. So what to do? I mean, I think it's important, number one, to ensure that we continue to provide and that the international community provides enough assistance through UNHCR for Syrian refugees. Unfortunately, as the conflict has now entered its 10th year, or its 11th year actually, we're seeing donor fatigue is a real issue. So one is to up the funding for Syrian refugees. Two is to go back to what I said though, which is we also need to provide funding for the increasing numbers of vulnerable Lebanese. And when I say we, I mean the collective we. I mean the international community. President Macron is hosting a conference on August 4. I think it's essential that the international community step in, because what we are seeing is also a growing concern that as the Lebanese become more impoverished, more despairing of their own situation, they will continue and they will deepen and turn their anger on Syrian refugees. This is a real issue that aid providers have to be aware of, the political economy of assistance. So we have to make sure that both the Syrian refugees and the vulnerable Lebanese populations are being cared for.
Thank you. My time is long expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair Manning. Mr. Burchett, sorry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the excellent manner in which you've run this meeting, and also I am often complimenting you, much to the dismay of several members of your party and to almost everyone in my party. So I'm glad to call you my friend, brother.
Thank you for all of that, Mr. Burchett. You're recognized.
Yes, sir. Feel free to use that in a campaign ad. Lebanon has been without formal government for almost a year. Has Hezbollah taken advantage of this circumstance to increase their influence within the country? And if so, how? If any of the panelists would care to answer that, please.
Representative Burchett, thank you for the question. I think Hezbollah has been now engaging in this balancing act, for some time inside the country. They have the military arsenal, unlike the other political parties, to be able to impose their will when they think government decisions are not going their way, or when they want government decision to be made to go their way. But at the same time, there are limits to how far they can go without upsetting the status quo, which is very much now in their favor. I mean, they started as a party that is anti-establishment, anti-political system. And since 2005, when they joined the cabinet, they have become the protector, the defender of the political status quo. And then the relationship that they have now with the president of the republic, General Michel Aoun, is a relationship that is very much beneficial to Hezbollah, and they don't want to end that. And so I think they already have the kind of power they can, they need to maintain the status quo, to maintain the paramilitary status they have, but at the same time, they don't want to use that to upset or upend the status quo.
Thank you. And the rest of the panelists, in the wake of the Beirut port explosion, the Lebanese people took to the streets to protest against Hezbollah and even against Hassan Nasrallah himself. Is there still any anger against Hezbollah in regards to the blast?
Representative Burchett, I believe that there is still a great deal of anger toward Hezbollah for the blast. While there hasn't been any definitive results of investigation that have come out either from Lebanon or the U.S. role in providing support for an investigation, none of this has been made public. There have been some Lebanese, including Lokman Slim, who had said that actually Hezbollah was siphoning off some of this ammonium nitrate to provide it to Syria to use for dropping barrel bombs on the Lebanese people during the civil war. None of this was ever validated, but Lokman Slim was assassinated most likely by Hezbollah in February 2021. I think that there still is a lot of popular anger against Hezbollah. Also, the fact that Hezbollah, which has more largesse, maybe money coming in from either narco trafficking or illegal entrepreneurship or just from Iran, that it's able to help its Shia constituents. There's an issue of relative deprivation. That once again, some of these Shiites can go and get subsidized goods in grocery stores, and the rest of the Lebanese population has seen its savings wiped out and nobody to care for them.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
You have just over a minute, Mr. Burchett.
Okay, real quickly. The 1932 National Pact divided the Lebanese government positions based on the three most popular religions, the Maronite Catholics, the Sunni Muslims, and Shia Muslims, with the population of Muslims significantly larger than what it was at that time, now even larger than the current Christian population. Is there any appetite for a change to the government structure among the Lebanese people?
I don't know if one of my colleagues would want to answer that. I think that it depends who you ask. Right now, we see Hezbollah looking at this and saying that they want to divide the parliament into thirds and revisit potentially the National Pact or the Taif Accords about power sharing and the nature of the power sharing. The system is incredibly problematic as is, but protects an element of the Christian community that is much less than it was. I think.
I think we lost him, Mr. Chairman.
It appears Mr. Schenker is having some technical difficulty, so we'll try to get that worked out. And Mr. Burchett,
that's my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellent clock management on your part.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keating, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to recent reports, the UK plans to cut its programming in Lebanon entirely. Among other bilateral cuts, it's fair to say, across the globe that they're doing. These cuts are likely to hit many parts of the world hard, but where's the British assistance in Lebanon focused? What's the impact, do you think, that these cuts will have in Lebanon? And should we be concerned about how to mitigate that damage should it occur?
Congressman, I'm happy to take an initial stab, but I want to tell you right off the bat, I'm not deeply familiar with the specifics of the British assistance portfolio in Lebanon, other than to say, I know that they've played, I believe, an important role in the education sector, which I've also highlighted in my testimony, as being frankly critical to building back Lebanese capacities. I do think we are seeing the country transform before our eyes from what was once a solidly middle income, fairly well-educated population to an impoverished population suffering from brain drain, as my colleague Rhonda Sleem noted eloquently. And so I think any pullback of bilateral assistance from our allies at a time when the country is suffering and quite frankly in need of more, not less assistance, particularly though assistance that's channeled not through the Lebanese government, but actually goes to directly. So the education assistance, for example, can often go through NGOs to the schools themselves. And so I think any pullback from any of our allies at this time is inopportune, to say the least.
And a second question I had, it might be difficult. It's one of perception, so it's a little, but I think it's important to bring up. It was just November the OFAC sanctioned Gibran Bassil for corruption under Magnitsky authorities, and these sanctions are well deserved and overdue. But I've come to understand that in Lebanon, some of that is viewed as just anti-Hezbollah and not dealing with corruption. And it's hard to ask a perception question, though, but is it getting through that our actions are really based on, the anti-corruption and dealing with that? Is that getting through with actions like this?
I'll take an initial stab, Congressman. I think it's an excellent question. Look, I think it's important to note that the Lebanese themselves had a phrase throughout their protest, which was in Arabic, kullun yani kullun, meaning all of them means all of them. And so from the Lebanese popular perspective, corruption is something that is pervasive across the board. So from my perspective, I think those sanctions were important, but I actually think that the threat of sanctions should really reach across the political spectrum in Lebanon, frankly, to include even our allies who may be tarnished by corruption, if those sanctions are to really maintain their importance and their signaling as being truly anti-corruption, as opposed to trying to go after particular adversaries.
I think that's an important distinction too. So thank you for bringing it up. I don't have a clock on me, so last thing I'm going to ask, if there's time, is in terms of the essential relief and aid that we're giving. I don't think in the hearing, I might have missed part of it. How has the COVID pandemic affected that?
There is now a new wave of COVID again. There is a surge because of the Delta variant, but Lebanon has been undertaking an effective vaccination program thanks to vaccines from the United States through COVAX. And however, I think there is a race between the rate of vaccination versus the rate of infections. And so for a while, there was a decrease in the rate of new infection and the hospitalization. Now we are seeing a sudden surge in that. And it's happening at a time when the hospital system, is under major stress because of a number of factors.
Great. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Stube, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the State Department in fiscal year 2020, the United States provided $216 million in combined State Department and DoD military aid to Lebanon. These funds are to help counter Syrian and Iranian influence. However, there are concerns about assistance to the Lebanese armed forces being diverted to Hezbollah and other designated terrorist organizations. And as I mentioned earlier in this hearing, Hezbollah does in fact benefit. Lebanon's economic crisis is ranked in the top 10 most severe crises globally since the past few decades. Past U.S. administrations have criticized the decades of mismanagement, corruption, and failure of Lebanese leaders. Lebanon is changing by the day. Political groups are taking advantage of the crisis. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. My questions are from Mr. Shanker. Do you know how the allocation of U.S. taxpayer assistance in Lebanon is handled with the lack of transparency and corruption there? And what safeguards are put in place to ensure access is based on need rather than on political and sectarian affiliation?
Thank you, Representative Stubbe. Well, the money is channeled through FMF. The 120 million this year, 115 million will be channeled through FMF, which is the purchase of U.S. military equipment, ammunition, uniforms, and things of the like. Lebanon, I think it's worth noting again and again, has one of the best records in terms of equipment not going missing. We have allies in the region, I will not name them, but periodically we'll lose night vision goggles. That doesn't happen in Lebanon. Rifles don't go missing. When there's a sniper rifle and somebody gets killed in Israel with a sniper rifle, we go and see where that sniper rifle is. So the care for this equipment, it's not leaking to Hezbollah. There are other funds that have been dispersed from DoD, including reimbursement for work on border security with Syria, I believe, and this is channeled based on funds and receipts that are provided, et cetera, typically. So I don't see funds disappearing through Hezbollah. Now, there may be tangential benefits that Hezbollah has. For example, let's say UNIFIL operates in the south. The LAF is present. They are buying food, perhaps, from locals who are supporters of Hezbollah. UNIFIL is operating in the south and hiring people who may be constituents of Hezbollah. to do jobs for them on their outposts. But I don't see large scale funding or even small scale funding, U.S. funding for the LAF disappearing into the hands of Hezbollah.
Like the concerns many of us have regarding assistance going into the Gaza Strip with Hamas in power, the U.S. legal framework designates Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Since Hezbollah is part of Lebanon's government, how closely are we following the legal framework with that assistance? You kind of hit on that, but obviously I have concerns, my constituents have concerns about that money getting into Hezbollah's hands.
Yeah, well, we can ask Moni Yakubian a little bit, having worked at USAID. Traditionally, we've not worked with ministries that have been dominated by Hezbollah. And now we're really not doing work in terms of the humanitarian with the government of Lebanon, because we do not consider the government of Lebanon to be a good steward of U.S. taxpayer dollars. They're corrupt, they're inefficient, and do not clearly have the interests of Lebanese people as a priority.
Well, thank you for your time today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important meeting. And I want to especially thank the witnesses today for their valuable testimony. I did have the opportunity to travel with Chairman Issa back in 2017 to Lebanon, both to Beirut and the Bekaa Valley. In fact, in the Bekaa Valley, was able to see some of the refugee camps that are there. So when you said that it is the country that holds the most refugees, I got to see that firsthand. Also got to see that there was a great, certainly people we met, a great love for the United States. Also interestingly, I represent the California-Mexico border, the entire border, and a lot of people are not familiar with this, but a lot of Lebanese Mexicans moved to Lebanon in early 1900s when it was still under the Ottoman Empire. In fact, did very, very well in Mexico. Carlos Slim, that at one point was the wealthiest person in the world, is of Lebanese origins and Mexican, of course. Now, and of course, one of the great movie stars of our time, Selma Hayek, is also of Lebanese descent. So I was incredibly saddened by the blast that happened a year ago, thinking I knew that Lebanon has had a lot of issues and problems, and with that blast, I thought it was going to be devastating for them. But of course, it's turned out it's been even worse than I imagined. And I did pay close attention to what you were saying as to what the United States could do, and one of the things that you said is keep the Biden administration engaged to make sure that we don't pull back. And the other one is the international investigation of the port blast. I would also say that it seems to me that we have to do more for refugees also within the country. That's a big issue for the country itself. But what else would you add to that? I'm one that wants to see our country continue to help and hope that our European partners and international partners lean in and don't move out. What else can we do? For whomever wants to handle that of the witnesses.
Well, thank you, Congressman Vargas. Listen, I think as my colleagues have said on the panel, it's important to end the notion of impunity that has been so dominant in Lebanon, and that's not just for the port blast. That is also for the murder of people like Lokman Slim in Lebanon, to make sure that there are not only investigations with public findings, but also that the people responsible are brought to justice. And for this to happen, particularly in the international cases, we're going to have to get our European partners on board. Unilateral pressure is going to be insufficient. U.S. pressure is necessary, but insufficient. As I said earlier, I think the many in Lebanon care a great deal more about French sanctions or designations, but it's required that they really follow through on threat. As for humanitarian assistance, by the way, I think we're doing a pretty good job on that in terms of our support for a World Bank social safety net program. We're now feeding something like 1.8 million Lebanese, per month. We also providing, 37% of the World Food Program that's doing quite a bit in Lebanon. That may have to be expanded as the situation further deteriorates. But I think we're doing our part on that, and we should work to make sure our partners are doing their part. Because we remain the largest humanitarian donor to Lebanon, like elsewhere throughout the world.
Before I leave, David, if you could tell me, why aren't the French leaning into this? Why aren't the French more involved? Is it the incapacity of their own country to get involved? Why is that?
Well, I think certainly in humanitarian terms, I think they give some money through the EU and less bilaterally. Although it'd be nice if they could do more on that front, considering their historic relation with Lebanon. But we've seen a lot of threats come from the French about if the Lebanese don't, come together and form a government that is a reform-minded government, then the people, according to President Macron, the people that are responsible for that are obstructing reform in Lebanon and are engaged in corruption would be sanctioned. And President Macron said that a year ago when he visited Lebanon right after the port blast, and we haven't seen that yet. Now, I hope that's coming soon, but this is really important. And so in your engagements, in the administration's engagements, I think we all have to be on the same page here to get the Europeans to put their money where their mouth is.
Thank you very much. My time has expired again. I thank the chairman, thank the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Schneider, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing, and I'm grateful for the witnesses for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Over the course of the hearing, I'll share what others have said and talking about the gloominess of what we're hearing about from Lebanon. You talked about the need for Lebanon to be a priority. I think we can all agree on that. But one of the challenges, and I said this long, I talked about it with my kids when they were young, the last thing you want to be is the 6th priority item on a 5-item list. And in the Middle East, there are so many priorities, whether it's making sure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, Syria, Yemen, you can run down the list. Why is it so important for Lebanon to be on that top 5 list, if you will?
Thank you, Congressman. I think because, as I laid out in my statement and in greater detail in my written testimony, I don't think the U.S. can afford the damage to our own national security interests that would incur in the event of total state collapse in Lebanon. Your point is absolutely well taken about bandwidth, and frankly about a U.S. that at this point is really more interested, I think, in lowering the priority and the profile of our engagements in the Middle East. But I think, and I'm grateful for this hearing, because I think, as I've noted, the lights are really flashing red in Lebanon. And I think the implications of state failure in Lebanon cannot be contained. They will have enormous impacts. I think, for example, the possibility of a massive displacement crisis, not unlike what we saw in 2015, should not be totally discounted, given the large number of refugees and now vulnerable Lebanese. I think the issues around how Hezbollah, and many of the questions in the hearing today have focused on Hezbollah. As I've noted, I believe Hezbollah is best poised to weather state collapse. It will emerge from state collapse in a perhaps stronger position.
And let me just, for sake of time, because we've spent hours on this whole issue, but you all talked about relieving the humanitarian suffering in Lebanon, but in the context of the overwhelming corruption, the organized crime on the rise, and Hezbollah, how do we make sure that we are providing that humanitarian assistance without providing unintended support for Hezbollah corrupted political elites and crime syndicates?
I think the answer is by bypassing the Lebanese government and providing that humanitarian aid directly to the Lebanese people. There are mechanisms that have been developed in which I have a little prop here, but we have a long history of providing cash assistance to Syrian refugees. This is something we've now perfected. There are others, UNICEF and others, who are looking at using this exact type of mechanism through cash cards to provide the assistance directly to the most vulnerable. They maintain their agency, it's far more efficient, and their dignity is also maintained.
Ms. Slim, do you want to expand on that from your perspective on things we might do, as well as specifically targeting the political elites? Who are the elites and what's the best way to put pressure on them?
Look, in terms of political elites, I don't think that, Congressman, I don't think that there are good guys and bad guys. They are all bad, but there are shades of bad. And some are worse than others, you know, and unlike, I mean, Hezbollah is the only party that has the kind of military arsenal to be able to impose its will on everybody else. The others do not have that kind of military arsenal. That's the difference between Hezbollah and everybody else. But everybody else is corrupt. Everyone is corrupt. And I don't think we can distinguish between bad and good guys in Lebanon. The good guys are the Lebanese people who are protesting in the streets and who are trying to upend this political system. In terms of humanitarian assistance, I think there needs to be, within the international community, of thinking about a different way of channeling aid to Lebanon. And there are mixed records of how you do that in the international community. And there are experts now in Lebanon who are calling for the establishment of a supranational authority, you know, that is made and that is staffed by Lebanese experts known for their independence and for their competence, that can answer to an advisory board made up of major donors to Lebanon. But through that international authority, all aid is channeled and all decisions about how aid is administered are made by this supranational authority.
Great, thank you. And I just a second left, but it's an important issue, and maybe I can turn to Dr. Shanker. You know, if Hezbollah is the worst in a spectrum of all bad, you know, the worst thing for vis-a-vis Hezbollah is the threat of, as you mentioned, there are 150,000 dumb bombs being converted to sophisticated, smart, targeted weapons that could threaten Israel, our most important ally in the region. And are there specific things we need to be making sure that we do as just threshold actions to ensure that Hezbollah doesn't get that capacity?
Well, thank you, Representative Schneider. Listen, there is no silver bullet for this problem. Israel has been very active in going after either Iranian missile targets or weapons transfers to Hezbollah via Syria in recent years, and that has been helpful. But I think in terms of sanctions, you know, you can't have Mahan Air flying into Beirut and offloading, you know, PGM upgrade kits. Likewise, we're not going to be in a great position if we turn over a whole bunch of cash to Iran in the event of a renewed return to the JCPOA, because this money is going to find itself right back to upgrading Hezbollah's weaponry. So we have to be really careful about the implications of a cash-rich Iran and what that means for a further deterioration in the situation between Israel and Hezbollah.
Thank you. Since I've been in Congress, even before, we've worked to make sure Hezbollah doesn't get the capacity, and I look forward to work with my colleagues on this committee, on the subcommittee, on the full committee, and with the chairman's support to make sure we do all we can towards that. With that, I'm over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. We are fortunate to have Mr. Issa joining us on the subcommittee today, and I will yield to you, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for yielding. As Congressman Vargas said, he went with me to Lebanon on the last trip to visit specifically a number of the refugee camps. And I'm going to make the assumption that all of our witnesses would say that our continued support for the stability of those camps and those personnel, over a million refugees, is a separate consideration, support for the UN and others, from the question of Lebanon. So unless someone disagrees with that, I'm going to change the dialogue a little bit back toward strictly the current government, including the LAF, and ask a question of each of our guests, perhaps starting with Dr. Slim. Isn't it time that in coordination with other countries, we begin a true process of tough love? As a Lebanese American, as someone who still has extended family in the region, as I've listened to this hearing and now years, decades since I first met with Rafiq Hariri, haven't we reached a point where, although we know that stabilizing the LAF is important, we know the contribution of AUB and Lebanese American University is significant to stability, haven't we reached a point where, unless we confront as a global united front of donors, confront all the sects that have systematically pillaged and raped the wealth of this nation, if we don't confront them in a united way, aren't we simply going to be talking again next week, next month, next year about money to stabilize the LAF in a failing nation?
Thank you, Congressman Issa, for the question. I totally agree that there is need to be a united front of tough love on Lebanon. And as my colleague here, Mr. Schenker, has already pointed, is that we need to have the United States, the Europeans, the Arab allies and partners come together in a concerted push, to help for the formation of a effective, competent cabinets of independent experts with executive powers to enact reform legislation. And there need to be the threat, and we need to all, come together around sanctions, targeting, again, everybody, whether through threat of sanction and eventually through implementation of sanctions. And it's important that these sanctions are viewed by all of the Lebanese as targeting corruption, as trying to undermine this political economy of corruption that has been sustaining the political system and sustaining these division of spoils among few political elites and brought the country to where it is today. However, I also think that the LAF remains the only national institution today that enjoys the respect of the majority of the Lebanese. It's trying to do its job in very difficult situations and without any kind of political cover by the political elites. In fact, there has been pressure put on the Lebanese, on the LAF, to use force and to try to stop protests by force. And there has been, some units in the LAF have resorted to unnecessary force. But in the majority, the LAF has been really trying to maintain this balance between maintaining security, maintaining stability, and also giving the space for the protesters to express their demands in the streets without any kind of force imposed on them.
I appreciate that. And because my time is so limited and there are so many important questions, I have just one quick follow-up that I'd like to make sure I get in. Under the election law that was in the previous election, members of the diaspora, even potentially me, would have a right to vote in Lebanon. There's currently a movement to stop that because of a view that foreign living Lebanese might be less favorable to the establishment. Should we, the United States and our partners, make the maintenance of that election law that allows for the broader election that we had a few years ago be a contingent on any and all future support, since that's well within the power of the people, the current leadership of Lebanon?
I am a Lebanese American as well, and I'm looking forward, in the future, if possible, to exercise my right to vote, if possible, in the upcoming Lebanese elections. And I think, and there is this hope. I mean, the elections provide a pathway to introduce a new group of independent political actors from civil society who can eventually start to create a critical mass in the legislature toward reform and toward change. Now, there are different reporting of whether these elections will enable 10, 11 new faces or 20, 11 new faces, but it's better than the current status quo. And so we need, as my colleague Mona said, we need to, insist, one, on the elections being held on time next year. And as we know, in 2018, the elections were delayed 5 years before they were held. They were delayed 5 years before 2018. And then second, we need to make sure that there is strict monitoring of the elections, by international monitors. And then three, funding contingent on this election held and on an electoral law that allows, these new faces, expats, to vote in the next cycle.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Issa. I will now yield to myself to conclude with some questions. Thanks again to all the witnesses. I actually want to try to focus on parties' interests other than the United States and Lebanon, but there's been a lot of talk of France. But I'd like specifically to talk about where our interests align with France and where they diverge. I also would like to talk about, Dr. Slim, you mentioned that Russia is eyeing Lebanon for expansion. I'd like to explore that a bit further. I'd like to ask whether any of you think that in part that may have something to do with, that may be as a result of not just the challenging circumstances that might present an opportunity, but also the belief that there may be significant oil and gas resources off the coast, if you could speak to that. And then finally, we've talked about Hezbollah, we've touched on Iran, but how is Iran maneuvering here? At the same time, how do the Saudis view this? There are lots of us who have a real interest in seeing how this plays out, but the result is the results that we may want aren't always the same. So can I start, Dr. Slim, with you to explore some of those issues?
Yes, I think on the Russian, thank you, Congressman. If I can comment quickly on the Russian aspect, as you well pointed out, there is significant Russian interest in the offshore oil and gas in the larger Mediterranean basin, the Levant basin. And in fact, the first licensing of exploration was given to a consortium of 3 companies, Total, Eni, and a third Russian company. And so that's part of the Russian interest, but also it's I think part of the Russian interest has to do with expanding their footprint in the Mediterranean region. And also they see their continued presence in Syria as aided by, for example, their presence in the northern part of Lebanon, which is, which borders with Syria, especially in the city of Tripoli and in the port of Tripoli. There is also Chinese interest in the port of Tripoli as part of the, BRI plan for the Middle East. So that's where, the Russian interests lie, primarily economic, but secondarily also political and expansionist in terms of footprint in the Middle East. Now, in terms of, sorry, maybe I should stop here and yield for my colleague to also answer your questions.
I appreciate it, Dr. Slim. Ms. Yacoubian, I'll follow up. Given what you describe as the total security breakdown and the bottom-up social, I think, explosion you called it, if you could speak to how Russia seeks to benefit from that, but also how Iran is viewing this. And then when we talk about whether it's tough love, we talk about targeted sanctions, we talk about Magnitsky, where do we share interest with the French in trying to achieve that? Where are the shared interests? Where do they diverge?
Look, I think there is a shared interest with the French on moving on with the sanctions regime. And unless the international community approaches this issue in a concerted, united effort, the Lebanese leaders have mastered the art of mining the differences in the international community to try to get away from implementing reforms, which they, in my opinion, correctly assess these reforms are going to hurt their interests. And so they are going to resort to any measure, possible to evade that, implementing these reforms. And so it's very important.
I'm sorry. Let me just stop you there for a second and give Ms. Yacoubian an opportunity as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Yacoubian.
Thank you, Chairman. Just very briefly on Russia, I think the Russians are opportunistic. I don't think they would look to try. I don't think they see chaos in Lebanon necessarily as working in their favor or not. I think they're purely opportunistic in their approach. Iran, on the other hand, I think, as I said before, the extent to which chaos in Lebanon enhances Hezbollah's strength, quite frankly, on the ground, I think is something that works, of course, to Iran's advantage. On the French, I think we're actually far more aligned with the French, and I actually think President Macron deserves more credit for having taken the lead on Lebanon. He is, after all, hosting the conference this next week. Here, I think US leadership is actually critical, because while Macron might be interested and has put sort of a lot of stock in trying to elevate Lebanon, France does not have the same influence, of course, on the global stage that the US does. And so I think we need to work harder to align ourselves with the French in terms of what type of cabinet we're looking for. I think the one concern I'm worried about is that the French may accede too easily to Mikati and to a check-the-box exercise in Lebanon that is essentially more of the same. We need to be very, very clear what we're looking for in Lebanon. And I think we do also need to step up in terms of laying out that credible threat, as I said in my testimony, of sanctions across the board against all corrupt elements. Last point on the Saudis, they had sort of washed their hands of Lebanon. And I think through our diplomacy, Secretary Blinken, and then later at the ambassadorial level, we're working to bring them back in to be, I hope, to play a constructive role. We need our Gulf allies on the same page as our European allies in addressing this challenge. Thank you.
Thanks. And finally, Mr. Schenker, if we've spent a lot of time in this hearing talking about, as Dr. Slim put it succinctly, how everyone is corrupt, I think is how you put that, Dr. Slim, focusing on the elites, the question, and we all expressed, we've heard from the three of you and my colleagues, the concern about mass migration, depending upon where things go. But what I'd like to finish with, Dr. Schenker, is to see if you can give us some sense of whether, if there is a full investigation, perhaps led by the UN, into the blast a year ago, with serious repercussions based on the results of that investigation, and if there is a recognized attempt to crack down on corruption, and if there are whatever other steps might be necessary, is there still a chance to regain the trust of the public in Lebanon, in the system, in democracy, that can prevent the cratering of whatever's left?
Thank you, Representative Deutsch. Listen, I think that some accountability would be a very positive step, but there has been no accountability for any political murder in Lebanon as far as I can remember. And we've had this tribunal, and even then we have a verdict. We know this guy was a member of Hezbollah's hit squad, and yet there are still no steps to bring this person to accountability. And this is, an endemic problem. That would be helpful. But we are looking at a situation here where the vast majority of the Lebanese people have lost their lives savings, even if there is some degree of accountability and they can claw back, the international community helps to claw back some of these absconded funds that have been stolen from Lebanese people in Europe or wherever these accounts are. The Lebanese people will not be made whole. Ever. And so there's going to be a lot of cynicism with that and a mistrust that goes forward. I think the Lebanese people do believe in democracy, but it's a very hard thing for them to upend the system. And this system has been there for generations. So it will take time, but I I think the Lebanese people will go to the polls. But I don't think these elections will be determinative. I think you're going to get 10 seats changed. And I think you're going to have a very disheartened Lebanese people for the foreseeable future, regrettably.
All right, Mr. Shanker, thanks. I was hoping for some more upbeat view looking off into the future, but we ended where we started, which is a really challenging and difficult moment for Lebanon. I thank all of our witnesses for your participation. This is a really important and timely hearing. Your insight contributed a great deal to the work that we do. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the ranking member. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.